Welcome to Community Roundtable. I'm Nick Burns from the Salt Lake Community College Communication Department, and I'm your host as we explore topics of special interest and concern to all the residents of the cities and the unincorporated areas of Salt Lake County. Topics that are equally important, we feel, to the general public throughout all the state of Utah. And today on Community Roundtable, we continue our series of special episodes featuring one-on-one conversations with our elected officials. Today, we welcome Representative Jim Matheson. This fall, he'll be stepping down from his seat in the House, and people everywhere wonder about his next political step. To the governor's chair, to the U.S. Senate, but we also want to ask Representative Matheson about job growth, about school and higher education funding, and about immigration reform. And for sure, we want to know his thoughts on the future of the Utah Democratic Party. So today on Community Roundtable, we'll find out what's in the future for Representative Jim Matheson. So hi, thanks for doing this.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, my pleasure. So jump right in. You've served in the House. You've been gerrymandered multiple times.
Yeah.
And you've served pretty much everybody in every corner of the state.
Most of Utah, that's right.
And to your advantage, I think.
Yeah.
But tell me, how do Utahns feel differently about sort of wanting the federal money that comes to Utah without any of the strings? It seems like things are a little different for Utahns.
Well, I think that that's a really good question without a simple answer. I think that at one level, it's hard for any of us to connect all the dots about where funds come from, where funds go, and how it affects people in their daily lives. And so that's not a criticism, that's just the way it is for everybody, and that's not unique to Utah. I think that's everyone in the country. That being said, I do think it's really important for people to be engaged and understand how our system works, where it works for them, where it works not so well. And, in terms of the relationship with the federal government in Utah, it's always been a complicated relationship, let's put it that way. My dad, when he left the governorship, he wrote a book called Out of Balance. And it was, the theme of the book was about the relationship of the federal government with the state of Utah. And he felt it was out of balance and it was tilted a little more in the federal government's favor than it should be. So that was back, in the 1980s. So that was a long time ago. So this is an issue I've always had an appreciation for. And I think there's always going to be a certain tension in terms of that relationship.
So lack of knowledge, though, for folks, that folks in Utah need more education from where?
I don't want to say it's just, I think there's always going to be a contentious relationship when the federal government owns roughly 2/3 of the land in this state. But I do think that it's often important for all of us to have a recognition about what the appropriate roles are of the federal government, state government, local government, or government shouldn't be involved at all. And I think that's always a good discussion to have. I think the balance is tipped more toward the federal side than it should. I think a lot of people in Utah feel that way. But I don't think it's without, it's important to note that there are certain federal functions that really do make sense for the federal government to do. We have a highway system that really is about connecting people and services and goods across this country, and having a federal component to how that's run is a good idea. And quite frankly, the federal money basically goes to the Utah Department of Transportation, so the state decides where it's spent anyway. So there are these interrelationships that aren't so simple as just the federal government's doing it or just the state government's doing it. It's actually layered in many ways with their different responsibilities.
Okay. Thanks. We had Senator Lee on the show not long ago, and he said he thought the federal government should pay property tax to Utah for the land that they own here. That was one of his suggestions for something that ought to be done. Would that add transparency, you think, or increase knowledge if there's like a deliberate property tax check?
I don't think that's a good idea. I actually think that there is a different program already in place that the federal government does pay money to Utah. It's called payment in lieu of taxes, and the federal government has acknowledged that on federal lands in Utah, and around the country, by the way, this is not unique to Utah, that state and local entities provide certain services on those federal lands. The most obvious being, let's say, law enforcement or ambulance and paramedic services. And so the federal government back in the 1970s, Congress in a bipartisan way created something called payment in lieu of taxes, which was an acknowledgement from the federal side that yes, Services are being provided on lands owned by the federal government. These services are provided by state and local entities, and they deserve to be compensated for them. So we've already got a system in place. We could argue about if the level of payment in lieu of taxes is appropriate, and I think that's a fair discussion to have, but I think that's the appropriate mechanism to address this issue.
Okay, cool, thanks. So here we are today at Salt Lake Community College. You know, we serve 60-some thousand students, but I wanted to ask you, because, you know, it does seem like a commitment to education is something you've talked about off and on, that, you know, there is this study from a few years back that showed half of all Utah high school students aren't ready to do college math and science for the very jobs that are going to be opening up in Utah. And so I wondered, what do you think should be done about preparing students better?
Sure.
And that's either from the federal side or at the state side.
Sure. It's a great question, and I think we should first step back and acknowledge that we've had this public education system in our country for a couple centuries where everyone gets to go to school. And that's been one of the great hallmarks of the United States of America. Sometimes I think folks may take that for granted. It's not that way in every country in the world. And this great effort to make sure everyone has an opportunity for education is part of why America has become the superpower it is today. That being said, particularly in the globalized economy that has really developed substantially in the last 2 or 3 decades, other countries in the world have really been aggressive about moving ahead to make sure they have a well-educated workforce. And by various metrics, if you look at the rest of the industrialized countries and different studies that are out there, U.S. students aren't doing as well, particularly in math and science. And so it's a fair question to ask about. For all of our success in the past, we can't just sit there and say this is fine and we don't need to continue to try to be better. I think we do. And it's pretty disturbing to hear the statistics you just mentioned, where so many students moving out of high school and going on to post-high school education actually aren't ready. We should not have our institutions of higher education having to spend a lot of its resources and focus on doing remedial training to have kids ready to go to that institution. That's not what this should be about. So then you asked a great question. What's the role for the federal government or the state government on this? Education has historically always been a state and local function. I think it should continue to be so. There are differences in the socioeconomic makeup of Utah compared to Illinois, compared to Mississippi. And so having a one-size-fits-all federal approach to education doesn't seem to make sense to me. That being said, I do think here in Utah we ought to be asking ourselves why we aren't doing better. We're doing okay. By various studies, in terms of test scores, we're doing just a little above average. But based on the demographic makeup of Utah, that's not very good. We should be doing a lot better. And I'm saying this as a parent. You know, I got my 8-year-old who I just dropped off at school this morning, and he's doing fine. But I will tell you that in the competitive world we're in, we probably need to be doing better. I don't have all the great solutions for exactly how you go about making that happen, but I would just suggest that we shouldn't stay locked into the models we've always used in the past, because the dynamics are changing. And we should be open to the notion that we could look for different ways to help our kids have the best opportunity to succeed. And I think that's one of the great challenges for this century moving ahead. It's a long answer, but I just got to share with you, I was recently in China, and the intensity with which kids are focused on education, and they go to school more days a year than we do here. In fact, most of the industrialized nations in the world have school years longer than here.
Way longer.
We're still at the 180-day school year, which is something we decided back in the 1800s was the right thing to do. Maybe we ought to ask a question about that. That's a simple solution, is maybe we ought to have a longer school year. I don't know exactly what the right answer is, but I do suggest that that's a conversation we ought to have.
Okay, and when we come back, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask a little bit more about education. We do have 30,000 students here on financial aid, and how we're going to pay for higher education once those kids are prepared. Certainly something I want to talk about when we come back on Community Roundtable, and we'll be right back with more with Representative Jim Matheson. We are back on Community Roundtable with Representative Jim Matheson. We're talking about education. And here we are. I mean, we are the largest institution of higher education in the state. 60,000 students total. We do all kinds of good work here, you know, from plumbers and electricians to psychologists and on down the line. But 30,000 students here needed some form of financial aid last year. That's a huge number. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on federal responsibility and state responsibility when it comes to making higher ed, affordable?
Well, first of all, I think that I would separate this into two categories.
Okay.
One is why costs are growing so fast and how do we solve that? And I think every institution is going to have to address that issue about why costs continue to grow up from year to year. And I don't think there's a federal action that should talk about why higher education costs keep going up at a greater rate. I don't think the federal government should be stepping in and trying to affect education pricing. I do acknowledge, though, it's a serious issue in this country where the cost of higher education has grown at a greater rate than inflation, gosh, for at least the last 3 decades, it seems, if not longer. And it's getting very expensive. And I think it's a fundamental question we all ought to ask about if there's really this competitive marketplace with all these different institutions of higher education out there, why is there not any price competition? I think that's an interesting question to ask. Salt Lake Community College, quite frankly, I think has offered an opportunity for students to get a higher education at a very competitive price, however. And I think that in Utah in general, our pricing of higher education is lower than most other states. And so I commend people in Utah for holding the line, but nonetheless the increases do continue here just like everywhere else. I said there are two issues. The other issue really is how do we make sure everyone has an opportunity for this, and that is where there is a federal role. At least historically there's always been a federal role, and that is the opportunity, making sure there's an economic opportunity for people to attend higher education through two types of financial aid. One are direct grants, where based on income levels, people are eligible for direct grants of federal money to help pay for higher education. The second component are student loans, which are federally subsidized student loans so that students have the ability after the grants to also get a loan at a decent rate to help fund their education. And the motivation behind that, which I still think is appropriate, is making sure that everybody has a shot in this country at doing it. I think that should continue. I believe that we ought to make sure the federal government maintains the economic value of those forms of financial aid relative to where education costs are going, and that's a challenge because there's not a lot of extra money in Washington. But I think that the grant money needs to be there at an adequate funding level to help make college affordable, and it's something I've always supported. It's the investment in the future, quite frankly. Everyone likes to talk about investment. And I think investment in people is the best investment we make. It's how the United States is going to compete with the rest of the world. We don't compete on quantity. There are more than 1 billion people in China and 1 billion people in India. We compete on quality, and the quality is based on our people and how well prepared they are. And education is the way you invest in it.
And yet at the state level, at least in Utah, and Utah's not alone, we see state support for higher education overall dropping. I mean, this particular year, the Utah legislature was great to higher education in this state, but tuition has doubled in 10 years. Yeah. State support has dropped. The state contribution to Salt Lake Community College has gone from 75% of the total cost to half. Mm-hmm. So what's a state to do?
Well, it's a question of priorities, and we ought to talk about what the capabilities are for the state to support the system of higher education and what the relative mix is of sources of funding to make higher education work. Tuition is one source, state support is another. There are other sources of revenues that fund the system as well, and it's all a question about how you divide up those responsibilities, if you will, and how you set those priorities. But I'd like to think that without at the risk of repeating what I just said in the previous question, I'd like to think we all value investing in people. I think this is the best investment we make, and so I'd like to think that there would be a commitment on the part of the state to really make sure that our higher education system is appropriately funded and done so in a way where every kid in this state who wants to access that is not facing exorbitantly high tuition. Right.
I mean, we are pretty much dead last in terms of K through 12 funding. Mm-hmm. We do great graduating white kids. We do relatively poorly with students of color from K through 12. Mm-hmm. But let me move on, because you raised some good points, and it takes me then to the next big issue that I wanted to ask about, and that's overall immigration. Mm-hmm. You know, we were just talking about this plan in Congress to raise fees on H-1B visas, right, to allow more high-tech workers to come in, even though that tends to drive down wages. And so what do you see in terms of immigration reform? Because to me, Utah used to kind of be out on the forefront of some good ideas. to some people in terms of immigration, and now it seems, at least federally, it's kind of dead.
Well, I think every day we do not reform our education system, our economy is put at a greater disadvantage with the rest of the world. I think that no one would argue our current immigration system is functioning well. In fact, I suspect just about everyone would say it's a dysfunctional system today. And so there's no question we need to reform our immigration system. Now, this is a tough issue, and it's a complicated issue. And I work in a business where a lot of people like to fit their positions on a bumper sticker. And this is not the type of issue where we ought to talk about it that way. But we've got a system that is not very transparent. It's not necessarily rewarding good behavior as it should, and it's not treating everyone very fairly in terms of those who want to play by the rules versus those who don't. So I think immigration reform in the broader sense has got to happen. Now, this is not a new issue, but in my time in Congress, we've never seen much progress on this issue until this session of Congress, where the United States Senate actually passed in a bipartisan way, in a time when no one thinks Congress is coming together on many issues. The United States Senate actually passed a bipartisan bill to overhaul our immigration system. Now, there may be aspects of that bill, in fact, I'm sure there are, that we could all say we don't like this aspect of the bill or that aspect of the bill. I have some issues with the Senate bill. But that being said, I do at least acknowledge the progress made by a bipartisan bill to move immigration reform forward. Sadly, in the House of Representatives, nothing's happening. And the Speaker of the House floated a set of principles for immigration reform earlier this year, and after he floated it, within minutes in the social media and talk radio world, he got shot down. And it looks like we're not going to move forward on any type of bill in the House, which I think is really unfortunate, because at the end of the day, I'd like to think as elected officials, wherever you are on the issue and wherever you are on the political spectrum, you ought to be trying to do the right thing for this country to help us move forward and make some progress. And like I said at the start of this answer, no one thinks our current system's working that well. Everybody can acknowledge we probably ought to change it. And so I'd like to think we'd have more of a good faith effort to try to reform the system.
You mentioned your ambivalence about the Senate bill. If it came up for a vote, if the Speaker would push it forward, would you vote for it?
I think the Senate bill, if it came up for a vote, would likely pass the House, actually. And but I think we'd all like to have an opportunity to take a crack at it and offer some ideas or some amendments about things we might want to do to make it better. I can tell you one specific provision, just to pick one out as an example. The number of visas allowed for construction workers is capped at a level that I think is too low. And I think, realistically speaking, it ought to be increased to a more realistic level for the needs of this economy. And those are the type of discussions we ought to have. I mean, I said earlier, this is a complicated issue. This is really complicated. There are a lot of emotions, and there are all kinds of layers of this issue. But if we don't even bring it up for a vote or try to be deliberate about the issue, we're not going to make progress.
Well, there isn't even any talk going on.
There's not much talk going on now in the House, as I said.
Right.
And there's some folks who say just don't bring up anything. And I think that's unfortunate, because, as I said, most people in this country think that the current system isn't working. And it's actually rewarding bad behavior by some people, and it's penalizing good behavior by others. That's not what we should be doing in this country. We should encourage good behavior and reward good behavior. That's sort of what the rule of law is all about, as far as I'm concerned, and our immigration system isn't doing that right now.
Okay, good, thank you. When we come back, I want to ask a little bit about the Democratic Party right here in the state.
Sure.
And of course, everybody wants me to ask you, and I want to ask you, what's the future now that you're retiring from the House? So that when we're back on Community Roundtable, we'll talk more with Representative Jim Matheson. We are back on Community Roundtable talking with Representative Jim Matheson. So I want to ask a little bit about your future. Retiring from the House, again, your district's been gerrymandered from here to heck and high water. What would you say on reports that the death of the Utah Democratic Party have been greatly exaggerated?
Look, there's no secret that the Utah Democratic Party is in an extreme minority position when it comes to, if you look at just all the elected officials across this state at all levels of government. That's a challenge for the party, and that's a challenge for our state. I think when you don't have a competitive situation, you have less accountability. I went to college in Massachusetts. When I was there, the Democrats held just about every office in Massachusetts. I saw a lot of the same dynamics there that I see in Utah. So it doesn't really matter which party it is. If you have dominant control of one party and another party in an extreme minority position, you lose some of those components of accountability and that really make our system work better. So that's the broader concern I have about the partisan divide or the makeup in Utah. But I think it's incumbent on everybody who's running for office these days, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or whatever party they are, to really offer more of a constructive agenda about how they're going to make things better. I think that's more what the conversation ought to be, and we ought to get away from these simplistic, empty phrases that seem to dominate our political discussions, and this notion that all Democrats think this and all Republicans think that, and there's only two ways to look at an issue. Boy, I wish life was that simple. And there may be some absolutes in life where there are only 2 points of view, but most of the issues in the public policy domain have lots of different points of view, and we ought to acknowledge that in how we evaluate people running for office, and we shouldn't be so tied to one party label or the other.
So stepping down from the House, what's going on?
Well, I never saw myself as a lifer in the House of Representatives. It's been an exceptional experience for me and very meaningful. But 14 years is a long time, and I'm ready for the next chapter in my life. It's an exciting time for me actually to think about. I'm doing something else, but I can't deny I'm leaving with some mixed feelings because it's been a remarkably special and experience, and it's been a real honor. I've met so many great people in Utah. People ask me, what do you like about being a congressman? I say, the answer you might not expect is it's given me the opportunity to meet a remarkable number of people throughout our state in the public sector, in the private sector, in schools, in volunteer groups, wherever it is. There's a lot of good things going on in the state, and there are a lot of good people doing good things, and you never hear about them. When you watch the 10 o'clock news on TV, it's all about the bank robberies and the car crashes. Mm-hmm. It's like negative news sells.
Well,
but in my job, I've been given this wonderful opportunity to meet so many people doing positive things. So that's what I've enjoyed most about this job. It's something I'm going to take away from it, really valuing. But I'll miss it. I'll miss all the people I've been able to work with and learn from. And that's what's made me, I think, a more successful congressman, is I've had a lot of people in Utah who are willing to offer thoughts and advice and information, and they've just made me do better at my job.
And again, you've been in a rather unique place, being, if you will, the lone Democrat, mm-hmm. From what's arguably one of the reddest of places. Mm-hmm. So I have to ask, and it is the elephant here in the studio, and I don't mean a pun with that, yeah. But you talk about next chapter, and is that political, or will you answer?
Well, politics is a world where everyone loves to speculate, and I have no plans at this point. I tell everybody everything's left on the table because I don't know what I'm doing next. But I do know that I'm going to be working for a while. This word retirement, I mean, I have an 8-year-old, so I'm not retiring. I can tell you that.
Working at what?
So I'd like to just keep involved in something that's involved in the policy world, but I don't know what that's going to be. And I've still got several months left as the congressman from the 4th Congressional District, and I'm just making sure that I work hard and my staff works hard, and we're serving the constituents because we were elected to the full term. We're going to work the full term.
Yeah. So what's going on these last few months for you?
Well, as always, the big focus in my office is always making sure we serve our constituents well. When people think Congress, they think Washington, but so many people in Utah end up having some issue with a federal agency. It may be a Social Security or a veterans issue or IRS issue where they're running into red tape or confusion, and my office is always wanting to help people figure out how to resolve those situations, get answers, and so that's still the number one focus. It's been my focus from the day I took the job, and our office is in West Jordan for the 4th District, and we got great people working there, and that work continues, and that work always continues. You're saying what's going on in Washington? The agenda's kind of limited this year in Congress. Often in an election year, fewer pieces of legislation move. But that being said, I'm hopeful we can have continue to work on issues that are important to me, issues that help our economy grow. I've got issues in the committee I serve relative to telecommunications, relative to healthcare, relative to energy, that are all important. And we're just going to keep pushing. And that's what I was elected to do. And so that's what I'm doing, what I'm going to continue to do.
Well, we've only got a couple minutes left here, but you are quite well known across the state for your constituent services, so I will give you that. But, you know, Senator Lee's popularity has waned. Lots of people see Governor Herbert. Your dad was governor. I mean, you say it's a land of speculation, but no matter what you do, you're not going to escape that.
Well, when you're the, you know, I guess you got to find someone to be on the other side of the ballot in the Democratic list. It's kind of a short list. But look, I'm not trying to be coy with you or anything else. I've enjoyed this opportunity. I'm figuring out what I'm going to do next. I do not have some specific plan about running for office again. I can tell you that. I just don't. But I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm just trying to be honest about where I am right now as a person, and that is I'm trying to figure out what the next step's going to be.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you for a half hour to chat, which seems like something you don't do a whole lot, or at least you don't have the opportunity to do a whole lot or make time for. So that, again, it's going to breed speculation.
Well, listen, I think what's nice is the chance to sit down and have more of a conversation about issues that aren't limited by the nightly news where they can do a 30-second story.
Right.
So I appreciate that. I appreciate that Salt Lake Community College offers this forum. I think it's a great opportunity to sit down and talk about issues. And my gosh, I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about. So
maybe I can do it again.
Maybe I have to come back because there's no lack of things to talk about.
Oh no, I got another 2 pages of notes here we didn't even get to. So no, there's plenty to talk about. You going to move back to Utah?
I assume so. My family's always lived here. Actually, I never moved away. My family's lived here. I've gone back and forth, and you know, my kids go to school here, and my wife works up at Primary Children's Hospital, and so this has always been home.
All right. Yeah. Well, I hope you can come back and chat some more, because I have plenty more things I want to ask about. And certainly, if you do decide to be back in the political arena, you know for sure we'd invite you back.
Well, I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. Representative Jim Matheson, thank you for joining us on Community Roundtable. If you have a comment, if you have a question, maybe you have an idea for a show we ought to do in the future, then please get in touch with us. Our email address, roundtable@slcctv.com. And of course, you can catch all the Community Roundtable episodes. Check it out, slcctv.com. I'm Nick Burns, and hey, keep it tuned. SLCC TV.